You're listening to the audio portion of Workshop Wednesdays. Workshop Wednesdays is a free live discussion about topics affecting accountants, bookkeepers, and business owners. You can join the ABO group in Facebook to participate live Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Pacific Time. Just search for ABBO in Facebook. This podcast is brought to you by Schoolofbookkeeping.com, where you will learn, grow, and build a thriving bookkeeping practice. We have hundreds of lessons with almost every aspect of the industry. Start your free month today at Schoolofbookkeeping.com. Welcome to another Workshop Wednesday, where it's casual conversations for serious workflows. I think Noah and I were battling over who was going to show this thing at the bottom. But it's brought to you by School of Bookkeeping, where you can learn QuickBooks your way. Am I going to click it, Noah, or you? He is. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
This one. Yeah, we want this one to go up. All right. Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. Yeah, as Blake was saying, our workshops are eligible for CPE credit, and we do have, I think it's a metric shit ton of prior workshops available for CPE. I don't know if you want to set up that QR code. If anybody wants to check out our channel on Earmark, we have a whole bunch of prior workshops on School of Bookkeeping. I'm sorry, on Earmark from School of Bookkeeping. And I was telling you, Rachel, Blake and David were doing the accountant podcast. And at the end, they were talking about Earmark and showing the webinars and things that they had. And there we were. And they even called us
Yay!
out on the podcast, which is really cool.
Wow, that's great.
We're famous.
I know. And Earmark is so cool. I love it.
Yeah, it's really great to be able to do the CPE credit on your own time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to do that. So love that as an option for our community. So today's topic is all about the subtle nuances of inventory in QuickBooks Online. Right?
Or maybe not so subtle.
Yeah. There are some unique things that you want to be aware of, especially if you're coming from desktop QuickBooks and coming into QuickBooks Online, that it might be a whole new territory for you. Just when you thought you had everything under under control with your inventory management in QuickBooks Desktop, here you come over to QuickBooks Online thinking, hey, this is exactly the same. Oh no, not at all.
And people do. And yeah, it is really important to understand the distinction, because I often get a lot of inquiries of people just think it does the exact same thing, and it just doesn't.
Yeah, and we have a course on School of Bookkeeping all about handling inventory in QuickBooks, where we unpack some of the fundamentals about inventory management, really just talking about the concepts behind inventory management. And you do a great job of talking about periodic, perpetual inventory and defining those terms in that course. And then we talk about choosing the right version of QuickBooks for inventory, and just really what we call the 3 different buckets of inventory management when it comes to business workflows of I buy stuff, I sell stuff, or I buy stuff, I do something to that stuff before I sell other stuff. And then the advanced inventory of I buy stuff, I put stuff in a warehouse, or I send it to another warehouse, and I need to know where all my stuff is before I build it and then sell a different product. Um, those are the 3 main categories that we call of inventory management when it comes to that. And we lay that out in here. And then we talk about managing inventory inside of QuickBooks Pro or Premier inside of desktop, and then with QuickBooks Online, right? And so the main concept. I think that we want to make sure that when people are managing their inventory or running inventory inside of QuickBooks Online, is the they want to fall into the first bucket of I buy stuff and I sell stuff.
Yeah,
And you
and
call that a reseller, right?
yeah, and it's funny too because the more I've thought about it, and I have to be really careful myself because there's really two things at play. There's really understanding how inventory works and understanding the inventory workflow. And a lot of times I'll get wrapped up in that, and I'll sometimes forget that sometimes people need really just to understand how the software is working, right? And so that's a whole different thing. And so this discussion is really geared toward what can the software do. And but that is just as important, is really understanding the not the ins and outs of inventory. And because what we just said, a lot of people come to QuickBooks Online kind of thinking that it has the same workability as QuickBooks Desktop. And then the reason, and it doesn't, and the reason why it doesn't is because this ongoing discussion about QuickBooks Online, and I know a lot of people don't care for it, but I love it. The reason being is because of it's web-based and I can
Yep.
integrate it with really anything I want. So the more you think about it being cloud-based and I can really bring information from all different sources, and they can really improve the efficiency of their entire business by moving to QuickBooks Online and streamlining a lot of different things all at once. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, but once done, it really is just so cool. And the effort, or the end goal, is really, we're not necessarily doing all the things in QuickBooks Online, but we're bringing all the data into QuickBooks Online for financial tracking. And like you said, with a more of a simple operation of just buying and reselling stuff, in many cases that can be done in QuickBooks Online. But when you have a more complex manufacturing operation, you just don't even want to try. Just don't
Yep.
even try and do it in there. It's not going to work.
And it doesn't mean that you can't have inventory and not use QuickBooks Online, right? It's just
No,
whether
not at all. And I have lots of clients that do it that way. It just means that we track the inventory and the increasing and decreasing of the actual items outside of inventory, and we're just capturing the financial piece in QuickBooks. And one of the things I hope that we maybe can talk about today is like these subtle differences. Is I get a lot of questions of people that are often very confused about, I'm not tracking inventory in QuickBooks Online, so why am I still using product service items? And there's some confusion about really how that works and why that would be. So maybe that's something that we can touch upon.
yeah, I don't. We could certainly, especially when it involves inventory, there's a lot of weeds that we could find
Yeah.
ourselves in. But the general big thing, a big difference between QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online has to deal with its cost calculation
Yes.
and how QuickBooks is going to be calculating cost of goods sold for the items that are sold.
Yes.
And that is that's one of those nuances of inventory inside of QuickBooks that you really want to make sure that you're you grasp fairly well before even turning on.
Yeah, I
In
agree. And that is one of those things where you do want to understand the inventory workflow when it comes to that, because you want to understand that you're purchasing and you're purchasing things at a cost and you enter that. And we're not necessarily entering things with inventory adjustments. So there is a cause to make sure you want to know that workflow correctly. But anyway. Go ahead.
Yeah, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that QuickBooks Online is going to use FIFO as its cost calculation, meaning first in, first out.
Yeah.
And everything leads back to that fundamental thing, right? A desktop used a weighted average, and then if you were using QuickBooks Enterprise Platinum, you did have the option to calculate first in, first out inside of Enterprise. But where this comes into play with QuickBooks Online, because it's first in, first out, and it's only first in, first out, we just need to make sure that you're aware of what that entails. And so QuickBooks inside of an inventory item is going to have a thing called a start date. All right. So that it needs to know where the F of first in, first out is actually in. Now it's not FAFO, it's FIFO. But that start date is going to be super important when it comes to using an inventory item. Now, that start date can be changed, right? Like you can always change and move that starting valuation of inventory of here's that line in the sand of where I'm going to be starting using this item. And that can be changed with one exception if you've moved from desktop to online, right?
Mm,
So if you're starting natively inside of QuickBooks Online and creating a brand new item, you can choose when that start date actually is. The purpose being is that you cannot enter historical transactions prior to that start date for that item because that just as the name implies, that's the starting point of QuickBooks calculating fluctuating costs because it needs to know, right? If you start with 100 widgets at a certain cost, it needs to know when those are depleted before it starts to calculate the cost of goods sold of the next batch that might have had a increase in cost, right? So
yeah.
that's why that start date is super important. And one thing that I didn't even realize, I was trying to find this article that was on Insightful Accountant. Murph did a really great job of it, and I can't find it. Maybe it's under their premium content that I'm not paying for anymore. But he had, I was, I didn't realize that there's a limit to the amount of transactions that are going to be allowed for an inventory item because of that start date issue, right? So,
I didn't know that.
yeah, if you're using QuickBooks Online to track your inventory, you will have a maximum of 25,000 transactions affecting that item before QuickBooks
Mm.
says no. you're
And
gonna
then
have to you're
I
gonna have to
guess
start another item,
I was just gonna say, what do you just create another item?
right?
Um,
But then
can
you lose
I?
all the history.
Yeah, yeah. Can I just say though, because I'm you're such an expert, and so I'm thinking of this from the perspective of I started using QuickBooks Online 5 years ago, and when I first started using it, I was really confused, and it took me a while to really understand. And so I wanted to like just back up just a little, and I just wanted to say, if I was brand new to QuickBooks Online, the one thing that I want to be clear about to anybody that might be listening is if I have decided that I would like to track my inventory quantities in QuickBooks Online, meaning I want to know that I have bought 100 widgets and I have 100 widgets on hand, and then I sell 10, and then I have 90 left, and then I'm recording my cost of goods sold for those 10 items sold on a FIFO basis. Um, I just want to say you can only do that in Plus or Advanced.
Right.
So even though QuickBooks Online uses a product service item in Simple Start, Essentials, Plus, and advanced. Is there another one that I'm missing?
Ledger, but there's
Oh,
no.
okay.
I don't think there's any
I
products.
don't. Yeah, I don't think you can even do that in Ledger. But so even though all 4 versions do utilize the product service item, and and all that means is on an invoice, you can say, if you're a service-based company, your product service item is going to be landscaping. If you're Craig's Landscaping, maybe you've got landscaping A, B, and C. And so that product service item is going to point towards an account that's going to spit out on your financial statements, on your P&L. And when you're in either plus or advanced, you can use that product service item as a product, not just a landscaping service, but actually a product. And that product can be an inventory item or a non-inventory item. And all that means is, and the only reason I'm saying this is I wish somebody would have told me this right in the beginning, like I was a kindergartner.
Yeah.
And so in that, in plus or advanced, if I can do an inventory item or a non-inventory item, the inventory item is going to allow me to track the ups and downs of the quantity of what I'm buying and then what I'm selling. That's all. And that's what you would, if you were tracking your inventory in QuickBooks Desktop, that's what it'll allow you to do in QuickBooks Online with all of these limitations that, like what you're talking about with the start date and what can come over from QBD and all this stuff. But you can use non-inventory items forever and never worry about tracking inventory if you have to. It is an option that you can do. And like we've said before, there are many circumstances that I have clients that are simple enough that they are buying stuff and reselling stuff and not even a lot of stuff and small purchasing, that we can manage it very simply in QuickBooks Online, map it, and it's all great. And you can connect to e-commerce channels and so on and so forth. So that's something that I really wanted to say, because there are people that they may be super skilled bookkeepers, but they're not used to QuickBooks Online. And that is something that once you've determined those buckets, buy stuff, sell stuff, buy stuff, or whatever, then, you can do it. And it takes a little bit, but you'll get it. And you can really manage your inventory quite here in QBO. And good, I'm glad you're showing that.
Yeah. As you're talking, so there's the products and service list, which I think, to your point, the terminology is where people get bent around the axle about, okay, if it's a products and service list and I sell products, then I should track inventory.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that for sure, but there
Yeah.
are.
And sorry, just before you say this, the reason why I really wanted to hammer this home is because of my clients are constantly confused about this. And or not even necessarily my clients, but just other people I talk to. And so a lot of times they'll say, just point the product service item to this account. You in some situations you have to create a new item that is just going to point to an account. Sometimes you don't need to, and so it can get really confusing. So that's why I think it's important to talk about these fundamentals.
So as they're listed here, so I just brought up the product and service list and clicked on creating a brand new item, and the first thing it asks you was what type of item it is, right? So you've got your inventory items at the top, right? Products you buy and or sell to track quantities of. That's pretty much the workflow that you would want to do if you wanted to create an inventory item. Then it says non-inventory items, products you buy and or sell, which sounds very familiar to an inventory item. But don't need to, and then in parentheses it says or can't
Yeah.
track
And you know what?
quantities of.
I almost wish that Intuit would update that description to say, because this is again a source of confusion constantly, is to update that to say, because maybe you're tracking your inventory somewhere else, because a
Mm,
lot of people are coming to QuickBooks Online because they're tracking it in an inventory app or somewhere else, or
mhm.
in Shopify or in whatever, and we don't want it tracked in QuickBooks Online. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't be tracking it simultaneously here and
Right.
there. And so it's really important that non inventory items are being used if
Hmm.
you're tracking it somewhere else. So it's just sometimes they don't say that or
Yeah.
clearly enough. And so that's another source of confusion that I often see.
Well, that's job security for you then, right? And they use an example of, for an example, nuts and bolts used in an installation, right?
Yes.
Yes, you do not want to track the lumber that you purchased or job supplies as individual things unless you do, right?
Yeah.
Unless you have a whole stockpile of stuff that you need to know the comings and goings of all of that stuff. So,
Yeah, and that's a very common example of, I
yeah,
don't want to track inventory because I have a bag of nuts and
right.
bolts. In accounting and bookkeeping speak, that's true.
Yeah.
But now that we've entered this world of tech and integration and apps and all these different things talking to each other, it needs to be extended to, because if you are tracking your ups and downs in a different system, we don't want to do that here.
And then another type of item is service, right? So services that you provide to customers. So the basic difference between service items and non-inventory items is whether this is a thing
Yeah.
or labor, the work
Yeah.
that you're doing. So that's a simple thing. But here's the mind-blowing thing is that there is no difference to QuickBooks between
No.
a service and a non-inventory part as far
No.
as the functionality is concerned.
No,
So
they're
you can have,
basically the same.
yeah, you can have services that essentially are non-inventory parts, and they they behave the exact same way when you use them.
Yeah,
You
they
know,
do. And as a matter of fact, in some inventory apps, when it brings over these transactions, if the item, product service item, isn't there, oftentimes it'll create one, and sometimes it'll create a service item. And you're
yeah,
like, what? But the system understands them to be basically the same thing.
exactly. So just looking at my list here, right? This is my candy listing here. I have a 5 Beach Mint 10 count gum that's listed as non-inventory, which would have the same thing as it would have the same potential use as far as QuickBooks is concerned as this finance charge item that I have set up as a
Yeah.
service.
Yeah.
And this gets into some of the differences between desktop and online, where QuickBooks Desktop will have a variety of other item types that you can choose, like other charge payment
Right.
items and those types of things. But again, a lot of those don't have any different functionality. It's just what you call them to make
Yeah.
that make more logical sense.
Yeah.
But when we create an inventory item, I'm just going to open up one. The biggest things that affect inventory is this middle part here where it talks about quantity on hand. It allows you to adjust the quantity on hand that you have and your starting value. You can put in things for reorder points so that it doesn't physically get below a certain point before you reorder it, because last thing you want to do is run out of stuff when somebody wants to buy it. And then it'll list the quantity on the purchase order, and then it's going to ask you where do you want the value of your purchases to go to as far as what's on hand in that inventory asset account, right? That's the section of inventory that's on this particular type of item. And the nuances are all based off of some the things that you do inside of here, right? Because we were talking about first in, first out, the starting date, and a limitation of 25,000. And the reason being behind all of that is because every time that you use that item on a transaction, it has to go back to that start date to make sure that it is calculating that the O of the first in, first out, right? And make sure what what order that those items are in and what the cost what was associated with that.
Yes.
So if you use that item a lot, over 25,000 times, you can now see that as you do a transaction today and there's 25,000 transactions for it to figure out what is the cost of this one
Yeah.
item.
Yeah.
That's going to cause some, some
And I
gears to be
and
spinning and smoke to be
yeah,
coming out of the servers.
I would also guess if there's a lot of purchasing, right?
Yeah.
Coming in over and over and over and over and over, you've got many FIFO layers going on, especially like fluctuating prices. So it wants to know where it is in the queue.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Matt is asking, what's the most common error with inventory tracking? I would have to say the most common error is not setting it up properly, and where people will um, get an enter a purchase transaction but not use the items if they are using inventory
Yep.
items. Um,
Yep.
they'll just put in a bill, go down from their supplier, and they categorize it all to
Yeah.
cost of goods sold.
Cost of goods sold.
Well,
Yep.
you agree, Rachel?
Oh
That's
yeah,
probably the
yeah,
most.
yeah. That, and then also starting the inventory with an inventory adjustment, and then but really it's a bill that that it needs should have been added that way. And then also what I was going to say is putting putting the GL, or I don't know how to say a GL account like a normal speak, like the account,
Yeah.
an account that's not correct. And so I've seen it before where they're not, they'll put an an expense account where it's supposed to be inventory. So then the
Mm.
financial statements are all goofed up because it's pointing the wrong direction. So I've seen that before too.
And this that leads perfectly into a nuance of inventory items inside of QuickBooks Online, in that if you put the wrong account and you use that item on a transaction and you realize, oh, this was wrong. So maybe instead of sales of product income, this should really go to sales, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather have it go to sales. And you can change it, right? There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But unlike other items, you get this checkbox that says update historical transactions when you save it, which will tell QuickBooks to go back to every transaction that it was ever used in and put it into the sales account as opposed to sales of product income.
Yeah,
It,
I
now,
will. Go ahead. Go ahead.
and it won't do that, right? So it's, again, because of this whole first in, first out. I'm assuming, right? That's the problem, is that it can't go back to historical transactions and do this. By changing accounts, you're not able to update historical transactions when you save. So I'm just going to give an example. I'll go into the non-inventory item, do the same thing, go to sales of product income, and I'll change it to sales. Now I have this also update this account on historical transactions. So your service-based items and your non-inventory items as those types allow you to modify historical transactions when you say them. Inventory items that are set up as inventory items cannot do that.
Yeah, so basically you're not changing in where inventory items or have been posted historically. You're just changing the category. If are you saying if invoices were I'm having a hard time explaining what I'm trying to say, but anyway, what I was going to say though is you do have to be careful that though if you're changing something like, okay, so are you saying it doesn't allow you to do it if it was an inventory item?
Right.
And okay, so if it's non-inventory items, it will update historically. But
Right.
you do have to be careful that you're not changing something that was an income statement account to
Yeah.
a balance sheet account, because people use
Yep.
deferred revenue. And oh my goodness gracious,
Yeah.
my plea would be, if you're not sure, ask somebody with an understanding of accounting, because boy, that you can create destruction with that as well.
Yeah. And Matthew also pointed out you can't choose the starting date for those
No, you
historical transactions.
cannot. No, you cannot. It's
So
all or nothing.
yes, if this was
All or
used,
nothing.
yeah, that could change their income statement from prior years, and
Yes.
that may not be something that you
Yeah.
want to do.
So I would say use this really if you know what you're doing, and like really even then proceed with caution, because it can really throw a wrench in what you're doing. But Matt also had another question about the tracking the cost of tariffs.
Yes. That's going to be an "it depends" answer, I think. Now, one thing that QuickBooks Online cannot do inside of inventory tracking is calculate landed cost. If you want to roll the cost of things that aren't the cost of the item into the cost of the item, you cannot do that with a touch of a button, right?
No.
So things like tariffs, sales tax, freight, shipping, any other kind of fee that would come along with the fulfillment of your inventory items and being received is not something that you can easily track into the cost of the item when it's sold, right?
Yeah,
So
when it's sold, no, because that would mean you're going to put all the inventory related costs, such as tariffs and shipping and insurance and whatever, onto the balance sheet with the inventory and expense it at the point of sale. Your only option would be just to put it to cost of goods sold right off the bat. And if you're dealing with tariffs, chances are you're dealing with large quantities, and for my bigger sellers, and there you can't just hit cost of goods sold right away with that.
yeah, and there's a trade-off when it comes to rolling in all of these fees into the weighted average, or into the cost of these particular items, because you lose that visibility
Yeah.
into how much did these tariffs actually cost us, or these fees, or what have you, because you're just rolling it into that landed cost of that particular item. And so then you see the cost of these items are increasing because you're rolling into that final cost of that item so that it gets recognized when it's sold, but you don't see the visibility into how are these fees increasing over time.
Yeah, and
Yes, the
as
cost
a
of the
matter
item is, but is that due to the cost of the item, or is it due to the shipping? Is it due to the
yeah,
tariffs, or what have you?
and that's why, as a matter of fact, and this is really relevant in today's day with all these tariffs, I would highly, if you if you're somebody you need to track landed costs, then I would highly recommend you use an external inventory app such as Sin7 Core or Katana, if that might work. Katana does have some limitations, but I do like these apps because really when you're purchasing, you can split up all of the elements on the purchasing documentation, such as just the cost of your item, like period, end of story. And then if you need to add in additional labor costs or any type of premiums on that, or freight or insurance or additional duties or whatever, those apps have the ability to enter them as landed costs, so you can see the detail of that when you're looking in your inventory system. And then so you can separate that out. And then the great thing is then when it sends the value over to QuickBooks Online, it'll put the cost of the whole order all together on your balance sheet. And then when you do that little bit of cost of goods sold with each point of sale, it'll grab the portion of tariff that's allocated to that one SKU and the portion of freight that's allocated to that one SKU. It's really great. And so that's where I highly encourage you get with an expert in this external inventory tracking, because you really just don't want to do that in QBO.
Yeah, I think the best practice, if you're using QuickBooks Online to track your inventory, is to not try to figure out the landed cost of these fees and just keep it separate. Now, you could do things like associate a class to these items and tariffs and fees and whatnot, and then looking at your profit and loss by class, if you're not already using class for something else, you could then put that aside so that you can see the overall gross profit of these particular items. And then use that as a reporting. But if you do need to move these fees into the landed cost of the item, I would agree with you.
Yeah, and even like that same example that you just gave, I would still only do that if it was like a few shipments. I would not do it if it was heavy. And that you have those people that are like, I don't want to pay for blah blah blah, and I'm not gonna use something for what it's for if it's not made for that. And so that's where I've sometimes run into that before, where they want to force something into QBO that's not really meant to do that. And I'm also not going to lose any more of my hair over that. I'm not going to yank my hair out because we're trying to hack landed cost into QuickBooks Online. I'm not going to do that.
Right. Now, the last topic, because we're already over time, we went down several weeds. Thanks, Matt. For that is
but those are really important questions, and tariffs now are a huge deal, and that's why people really need to know, can I do this in QBO? It's a common question.
Yeah. One of the last things that we want to talk about with when you are using inventory, the cash basis reports are not going to be accurate, or they're not going to be what you expect them to be, because when you have inventory turned on in this whole first in, first out, that is an accrual based type of workflow. Would that be the simplest way to describe it, Rachel?
Yep. Because what we were saying earlier, when I recognize the sale at the point of sale, like when the sale is made, I'm recognizing the cost of goods sold at that point. And until then, I'm not recognizing it on my P&L. So you really have to make sure that you're doing your accounting on an accrual basis and you're running your reports on an accrual basis. So if you're buying and selling goods, I wouldn't ever do that on a cash basis
Yeah.
anyway.
And QuickBooks even tells you, but it doesn't tell you inside of QuickBooks. It tells you on an article. So cash basis reports are incorrect when inventory items have a zero sales price. So this is one of the causes of those things, but also just using inventory items in general has, because it has to go back to all of that the first in first out is going back to that start date, and all of that recalculation, it just excludes
Yeah.
most of the the inventory activities that they're doing. So they end up having huge discrepancies between cash versus accrual, and then whether or not these purchases are paid for and applied properly and in the right period. So that gets really challenging. So basically, if you're using in inventory items inside of QuickBooks, accrual based reports are the only ones that are reliably accurate.
Yeah, and this example is a really good example because that people might think, why would I ever have a zero sales price? It happens all the time because I can't really read that. But if you're pulling something out of inventory, like for a sample or a complimentary thing or whatever, or like say you're using them in your business. I have a hair salon and they'll use some of their inventory for to use up in the salon or whatever. You still want to recognize the cost of the item that you're using up, and so you'd use a $0 invoice, and so yeah, it's just not going to work on a cash basis report.
Yeah. And one other, okay, it just reminded me of one other nuance of inventory. Because of this first in, first out, like all of this, all roads lead back to FIFO here with regards to the nuances. Because of the first in, first out, the ability to make cost or value adjustments on your inventory is increasingly more challenging. Doesn't mean it can't be done, and it doesn't mean that there aren't workarounds. And we're not going to talk about any of those
I don't know how to
workarounds
do it. I
to
don't know.
do to do it.
And don't tell
Um,
me how. I don't want to know.
is that makes it much more challenging to do cost adjustments to say at any moment in time, this is the value of these inventory items. You'd have to do a transaction to do that, and the cost or value adjustment, which is in QuickBooks Desktop, to be able to do that. The only adjustments that you have inside of QuickBooks Online when it comes to adjusting inventory is a quantity adjustment. And because it's first in, first out, it's going to be using that as its guidance on what is the value of that quantity adjustment, because it has to go back again to that start date, figure out what the value of those inventory items are at that moment in time that you do that, in order to make associate the value of that quantity adjustment. So there isn't this option of creating a value adjustment or a cost adjustment if your inventory costs have gotten out of control because you've mistakenly put a decimal point. You'd want to
Yeah,
find the source transaction that caused that to happen and modify that in order to make that change.
yeah.
You're supposed to say something then.
Yeah, yeah, always with the original purchasing source documentation, always. The only time I ever would do inventory adjustment is when it actually needs to be done at month end, quarter end, year end, if there's breakage, loss, or something actually needs to be adjusted.
All right. That is as much as we could cram into 45 minutes of a workshop with regards to the subtle nuances of inventory management inside of QuickBooks Online. And we have had a variety of inventory discussions and various other things that we've done on workshops. And coming up at the end of this month, we're going to have a new player in the inventory management space, Settle, come
Oh,
on and
yeah.
talk about their uniqueness in the inventory management space. So look forward to
Yeah,
that.
it's so cool. But I just want to add one last thing.
Hmm.
Just for anybody that may be watching this now or later and watching a recording of this, I have not met anybody that has a stronger grasp on QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online than you. So if anybody really needs to understand like the inner workings of QBO, especially as it pertains to inventory, there is nothing more difficult that you can do in QBO than inventory. And especially if you're having to go back and look at historic and fix something or hunt for something or whatever, don't waste your time, sorry, Intuit, calling support. Your quick answers, like go to School of Bookkeeping. I'm telling you, just do it because you really know your stuff when it comes to this. Nobody knows it better than you.
Thanks. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I think it's part of the
I
history. Yeah.
Yeah, but I have to say this stuff because when I was first trying to figure out a lot of things, I'm an accountant, I understand accounting, but really have a firm grasp on the software and what it does and how it does it. Took me a while to get used to it. And I wasted a lot of time. And so I always would like to point people right to don't waste your time, just go straight
Learn from my mistakes. And that's
here.
and that's really what I've done over the course of 20 years is made a lot of mistakes in
Yeah.
order to get some valuable lessons in
Yeah.
all that.
So
Plus my
really
my
like
time in the point of sale and retail, that was definitely a learning by fire.
yeah, and
uh,
I don't think
for
if anybody had even the most complex question of screwed up inventory valuation within QBO, I don't think there's anything you couldn't figure out.
there's a will, there's a workaround, and
Yeah.
we'll figure it out. Appreciate that. Thanks again for joining us today. And next week we'll be talking about the death of tags. So we'll talk about the migration process for tags inside of QuickBooks Online and what it means for those people that were using them and want to use them in the future. Until then, have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the workshop. And that wraps up another insightful episode of Workshop Wednesday, brought to you by Schoolofbookkeeping.com. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and took away some valuable tips and strategies to enhance your bookkeeping practice. Remember, if you want to stay ahead in the world of bookkeeping and accounting, be sure to visit Schoolofbookkeeping.com. With a wide range of courses, resources, and expert guidance, you'll find everything you need to sharpen your skills and boost your career. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoyed today's show, please take a moment to leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. Your reviews help us reach more listeners and continue to bring you the best content every week. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover, reach out to us on social media or send us an email at support@schoolofbookkeeping.com. We love hearing from our listeners and are always looking for new ideas to explore. Thanks for tuning in to Workshop Wednesday. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep excelling in your bookkeeping journey. I'm Dan DeLong, and we'll see you next week.